Recent floods across parts of Nigeria left devastating effects on affected communities. Environmentalists linked such environmental disasters to climate change, with adaptation recognized as a vital mechanism to preserve and develop various climate vulnerable and socio-economic sectors.
Moroccan and African soils in general are poor. They need vitamins, they need fertilizers. So the idea is how to customize the fertilizers within these African soils. And then, of course, everything goes with water. You cannot, even if you have to have good sun, but also enough water, taking into account climatic conditions. So the idea of building such an institute is to focus on water aspect, as this is essential for life. Our body is 65% of water. And of course agriculture is heavily dependent on water and also very sensitive to climate.
Do you think there's a lesson for other African countries who are also, at the forefront of climate change in terms of what you've done with the water projects? Lessons for other African
I think this is of paramount importance for all Africans, because African can play an important role in the world scene. Why? In fact, many people will consider Africa as a problem, while this is really the solution for the planet, because 60% of Arab lands are in Africa. So, with enough water, or some water, and good conditions of fertility, we can produce, and we will feed the planet.
This is the energy transition and the industrial transition is fundamentally about transforming how the world actually functions. It's about transforming the single largest industry we have, which is the oil, gas, and in some parts of the world, the coal industry. So if we're going to go to net zero carbon by 2050, to go to, 80% reduction by 2030 in some parts of the world, it basically means that this industry has to transform itself. It's a 150-year-old industry. It drives much of what we know is development in many parts of the world, but we're already seeing signs of phenomenal transformation. So the growth of photovoltaic technology, for example, is one, which pretty much is happening in many parts of the world, including in some parts of Africa. We're seeing, photovoltaic energy now at maybe half or 60-70% of any other competitive resource. But the point is that this cannot be controlled in the old ways, partially because it won't work. We've got to make this transition much quicker than anything else. Typically, technical transitions have taken 50, 60, 70 years to happen. This has to happen much faster.
Because of the reports we're getting. And
yes, absolutely.
Yeah,
the imperative is very real. I mean, the impacts are happening now.
Yeah.
Every place in the world, and certainly all the ecosystems, are feeling the impact. And poor people and people in vulnerable locations, people in low-income countries, like let's say India and Nigeria, are facing the impacts most. So how do we actually reduce their vulnerability? We reduce their vulnerability by good development, by making sure that everybody has a decent house that doesn't actually use a lot of carbon to produce it, that they have water, they have electricity, they have all other basic services, and their life improves. So what we're saying is that we can bring these two things together, but it needs to for us to rethink almost everything that we've done before.
The genesis of 1.5 was from the negotiation, and people thought that 2 degrees was too high. Let's see if we can make sure that we stay within 1.5. But with the outcome of this special report, it shows that even the 1.5 is still a high risk for Africa. Not only because a lot of regions are already warmer than 1.5, like the Sahel and the drylands of East and Southern Africa, but the tendency is that the cost of achieving even the 1.5 in terms of adaptation intervention is still very high for most African countries. So it's no way a safety net for us to feel that the achievement of 1.5 will keep Africa safe from climate impacts.
Especially the Sahel area.
Especially the Sahel area. Yeah.
So how do you make do you see more migration from that area? Do you see more insurgency in that area with the increasing temperature?
Like I said during my presentation, 1.5 is disruptive. People don't migrate because they want to migrate, but when the temperature disrupts their livelihood, the tendency is for people to move. Even animals move. Ecosystems are moving.
Just natural.
Yeah, it's natural that everything will move when things are not the way it used to be. But the tendency is that when humans move, they try to occupy new spaces, which generates conflict. Or it could be abrasive in the sense that some people may not like to, they'll consider it like intrusion, right? Yeah. So the whole element of migration steps in conflicts and so on, which is inevitable because the conditions are changing and becoming unbearable for them to live in those places. So we will see more of that, even though the world might not be ready, because I mean, we know exactly the tendency now. There are not a lot of opportunities, so people want to secure what they have. So the tendency of dealing with coexistence is no more there anymore.
Earlier you talked about the effects of higher temperatures on West Africa, specifically where we come from. How bad do you think this situation would be for a country like Nigeria or other West African countries?
Unfortunately, from several perspectives, this region is the most vulnerable in the world, especially in the context of if we do manage to limit global warming at 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees would be significantly better for this region than 2 degrees, because one of the areas where this region is most vulnerable is water stress. So this region will see significantly higher water shortages, especially in the northern areas, where even if it's a Sahara region, maybe the precipitation will increase, but those which are currently providing the food for much of this whole region will see increased water stress. Another area is where I see special vulnerability is urban heat islands. So this region is 5 times stronger in terms of the urban heat island effect because of the different physical and geophysical characteristics, and this is yet compounded by the fact that urbanization is the third most dynamic and strongest in the world.
Wow. And then you also talked about the solution. I mean, it's not all wars. There's also advantages or opportunities in climate change. What do you think could be the opportunities for Nigeria? In terms of infrastructure development and generally, what are the opportunities for Nigeria?
Exactly. The countries which don't have yet extremely highly developed infrastructure actually still have opportunities to avoid a lot of the mistakes that we have done in the West and in the North a lot of the times. For example, cover it with urbanization with a lot of impermeable surfaces. So just simply putting everywhere concrete. We find that this is very bad idea. First of all, for the urban heat island effect, it makes cities hotter and more impossible. And in this region where it will get very hot, this is critically important. But the second is also related to extreme precipitation, like storms, flooding risk. These all aggravate. So you want to avoid covering everything with concrete, and there are many cities already taking action. Another area with opportunities is construction. You still are very smart in preserving a lot of your vernacular architecture. You understand why buildings are built in the way that they are built here without having to introduce a lot of artificial cooling, and still how to be resilient to the different extreme weather events. This wisdom is very important to be carried forward even in the modernization. Yes, of course, everyone wants more modern buildings, but it's possible to merge these two and to integrate the traditional wisdom into our modern buildings.
When it comes to adaptation actions, there's no universal answer, because what we learned is we deal with a lot of uncertainty of what the future might look like. And what this conference especially is about, that we really need to find out what are the specific risks that we are dealing with. Even in arid areas, semi-arid areas, we might have the risk of floods. coming off, and flood management might be completely new to some of our basins that we haven't been before. So really identify what are the specific situations that we are dealing with, and then try to find adaptation actions that what we call, for example, no regret measures, so that have some development impacts either way, and for all cases don't produce any maladaptation, so don't even make the situation worse. But to decide what is a good adaptation action and what is a bad adaptation action, we really need to know what are the specific climate risks that we are having here. And I think this is what this 1.5 report is, helped us a lot to get some more clarification what scenarios could look like and how to adapt to them.
1.5 is the limit that people are trying to keep the limit of this temperature. If it increases, it will change the whole scenario of the ecosystem and environment and impacts the livelihood of the people. For example, where I came from, the climate impacts most of the people. We are nomadic that have a livestock, agricultural people, and post-agricultural pastoralist. So the problem is, the key is the drought and floods, cyclic drought and floods. To overcome that, what we need is to use that destructive force and convert it or transform it into a beneficial, tangible, sustainable projects that will help the people to adapt to the environment and build resilience for the community to overcome the hardship of water scarcity and the consequences that comes water scarcity.
Appropriate techniques and tools for monitoring and evaluation must be accurate and efficient.
Thank you very much.
Implementation of some of your projects in some African countries like Senegal. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so the project is looking at the adaptation options that are available for sectors, such as the livestock sectors in Senegal, for instance. And we look at how the pastoralism organization have already a solution and adapt already to climate change, and how national governments, but also local governments, can support this adaptation by supporting the intrinsic capacity of these herders to adapt to climate change. So we suggest that government at the regional level could really support this mobility and the transhumance that herders are implemented already through all the region of West Africa, and that should be supported at the regional, national, but also local level for supporting this adaptation solution.
Are you saying that they should be moved in vehicles to the next grazing area? Are you saying there should be grazing routes for them, you know, across Nigeria? And that's very sensitive right now in Nigeria.
You have to secure the grazing zone and the fact to walk from one grazing zone to another one, and this is what we call corridor, and this passes through negotiation with farmers, with also any kind of production along these grazing zones. And this is really important because it's part of the systems of reproduction. If you put all the livestock in a truck and you bring them to the next market or to the next grazing zone, you are losing a lot of the systems, and the system will be not efficient economically anymore. So it's really important that we secure also corridors, walking corridors and transhumance corridors from one grazing zone to another grazing zone, and this grazing zone needs to be also quite important. And I think it's really important for the adaptation of the sectors.
Now, according to the UNI DSR,
extreme weather conditions have increased by 151% within a 20-year period. And those here say 1.5 degrees is actually not a safety net for many African countries, especially those in the Sahel, with huge impacts on water, agriculture, and land. I have a scientist who will be joining me. He is Raikada Athor. He's a scientist and expert on land use. Now, with extreme conditions and impacts on agriculture and land, how do you think a country like Nigeria and other African countries can grow to adapt to these changes and in terms of better land use?
Yeah. Well, two things. One is to adapt to extreme events, and one is to adapt to climate change. That's not exactly the same, you know. So that means for extreme events, all countries, north and south, they have the same problem. They have to produce enough to be able to buy food or to store food for these different periods. But on the average, what you can do in most African countries, or almost all sub-Saharan African countries, they increase the yield. If you look at the climate change, the scenarios of IFPRI, which is an international organization looking at changes, and they have made some studies on for all different countries in Africa, books like this, you know, climate change. And when you take into account what I'm recommending, that's at least 50 kilo per hectare, you can increase, in spite of climate change, you can increase in most of the areas, even in the Sahel, you can increase the production.
Okay, so in every crisis there is an opportunity. Maybe this is a good wake-up call for Nigeria to act together and in harmonious way, but comprehensively address the problem. You have a huge potential because it's one of the largest sectors that generate employment and jobs for small household, SMEs, and even some large corporations involved in the agribusiness, agriculture activities. So there are a few ways to do this. Obviously, this is an adaptation and climate resilience issue that need to be tackled. So the most obvious thing is to tackle the supply chains and try to work on resource maximization, efficiencies, improvements, smart agriculture, and so on. So to improve and adapt to long-term climate change, but immediately leverage the synergies between mitigation and adaptation.
You look at it from both possibilities to address climate changes. Africa is not that much involved with attenuation, but it's really impacted by the effects of climate change and has to adapt. The problem with adaptation, because there is a lot of money in climate finance, there's a lot of money available. It's never enough, but the one that is available is not easily accessible. It's not easily accessible because most of the banks say we need to be able to measure the impact of the projects in adaptation. So that's why we came up with the concept of adaptation metrics. So trying to unify a way to measure the product of adaptation.
I think that largely research in adaptation in Africa has drawn from the knowledge base globally, and a lot has also happened on the African continent, but in terms of its relevance, it appears that we need to do a lot of contextualization in terms of the downscaling of the knowledge that is at the global level. We need to do more local content-based research that are more relevant to the local issues that we have on the continent. So by and large, I think that we have made some effort, but still there is room for more improvement.
Climate change has great impact and effect on young farmers, especially for someone who's going into agriculture for the first time. If you look at the flood issues we had in Nigeria recently, for someone who probably is in the northern part of Nigeria, you discover that the flood had serious impact on most farmland. So it's a loss to them, and that could also be discouraging. So I feel that if they can get support from government, from stakeholders, so that they can recover whatever they might have lost as a result of the flood.
No, one of the most important thing that we have to keep in mind is that how can we make the agricultural sustainable so that the production could be achieved without any decline in crop yields and production per se. So the most important part is the adaptation can make a big difference in this context so that the reducing or declining yield can be brought back to the normal conditions so that the system can become highly resilient to the changing climatic conditions. So for us, producing food on a sustainable basis and feeding this growing population is very important. There are lots of challenges, but we think that adaptation can make a biggest contribution to achieve this or to solve this problem.
We don't have to reinvent all the problems of the past to apply it here. Second thing is that the counterpoint perspective is that you can't apply directly the lessons that you have in the US or in Europe. You can't directly apply them here. You can ask the same questions, but you don't have the same answers necessarily. You have to adapt them for the locality, for the climate, for the region, and for the social population, the culture. So that's another aspect that has to happen, that has to be understood. But I think from a standpoint of the questions that Africa is posing, Africa has all of the issues that the world needs to solve the next 50 years. And this is the place to solve it right now.
The adaptation metrics and techniques for water, agriculture and resilient cities, which held in Bengueria, Morocco, brought together researchers, journalists, local authorities, climate negotiators, government representatives and experts from relevant sectors to proffer sustainable solutions and share examples of successful adaptation projects from across the world. In Lagos, stakeholders in the environmental sector came together to discuss the implementation of Nigeria's nationally determined contributions in preparation for the Conference of Parties COP24.
Different countries presented their NDCs at different times. And we have pre-2020 ambition, if I'm correct, and there is another date for 2025. When do we start counting your NDCs? Those are some of the common time frames, because people presented their NDCs at different times. And then the kind of targets they have in their NDCs is different from the target. Your own country, Nigeria may have different targets. Senegal will have different targets based on their own national circumstances. But at the global level, we must look at all these things and measure it so that people will report on their NDCs. So everybody is going to agree on the timing for that reporting.
Youth always have to be mainstreamed in the climate change process. Under the AU, we have the Committee of African Heads of States on Climate Change, and they're supposed, the mandate is for youth and gender to be included in the negotiations at the national level. They must go as country representatives. So we have been pushing for this with the ministry, and we're looking at youth have to be included. Even the new UN strategy for youth says that youth must be included in all the policy making, in financing. There has to be special financing for youth involvement in the climate change negotiations. Because even if climate change is a major issue for us, it creates a vast amount of, there are so many opportunities with climate change. So there can be entrepreneurship, there can be funding, inflow of funding coming in as a result of climate change and green projects, clean development projects. So we have to be able to position ourselves properly to tap into all the opportunities that arises from climate change.
We need to come to a collective point where we say, this is what our issues really are, and this is how we need to deal with it. We can't copy from another country. We have climate-specific challenges accruable to Nigeria, and funds accruable to Nigeria for those challenges, like Titi said. It's so true. But what qualifies it for us is for us to know it and better package and present it in a way that we can access those funds.
When Nigeria has a position with other countries, maybe in Africa and the world, our issues can be heard. And I know that the government is working on a paper and so on, but we need the government, we need the private sector, we need the civil society, we need the academia, so that a consolidated position based on what is happening in Nigeria is presented to the world. And also, of course, the critical thing is that once we leave COP24, there is implementation of what we agreed to implement in our country.
Nigeria should first showcase what they have done so far since 2015 Paris Agreement. They should also make it available, not only showcasing it at COP24, but making the information available to the rest of this country, because climate change is a cross-cutting phenomenon. And so if we get to involve a lot of economic actors across the board, the better we can implement more projects. And you heard we talk about access to finance, which is the critical angle. US withdrew their contribution to the $100 billion this year. So we need the money. And you also heard the green bond. It's a bond, it's a loan. And so we have to build the economy that can sustain repayment of such bonds when the time comes.